Good evening. Thanks very much for the invitation. I can't believe there's so many people here, so it's fantastic. When I was trying to put this talk together, I realised that I've been doing this for 30 years next year, so I was trying to condense 30 years worth of work into half an hour of talk or whatever, so I thought, this is going to be interesting. So, what I want to do tonight is talk about battlefield archaeology generally, and potentially what the... Oh, sorry, is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah. No, that's not. Unbelievable. Not that well. So, hold on, I'll turn it on then. Is it on? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I don't need to see you guys, do I? Yeah, so basically, discussing battlefield archaeology and how, if anybody wanted to show a bit of willing, you could do the same sort of thing as I've been doing for 30 years and potentially find the battlefield at Ellendune. So, without further ado, we'll move on. This is working. Right. I know some of you can't read the text at the back, so what I'll do is I'll briefly read some of this as well, so it'll make sense. So in terms of the archaeological evidence of conflicts, the 9th century exhibits very little in the way of reliable information. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for example, is full of references, absolutely jam-packed, full of references to conflict, of various conflicts and battles, including Ellendune, obviously, but very few of these can currently be pinned down, including this one. Archaeologically, to an exact location, and it's important to note that when not related to a town, a city, or a fortress, because obviously if somebody had a fight in and around York, then it's a lot easier to tell you where York is, for example, than it is in the middle of a field where you don't even know to start within a few square miles. So is it potentially possible to locate a 9th century battlefield, which I'm sure you're interested in? Ellendune is not alone. Hang on, should I go to that? No. Ellendune is not alone. The locations of most famous pre-firearms battlefields from around the world have never been archaeologically identified, and some of which might surprise you. For example, it's not just Ellendune, it's Agincourt. There is still no archaeological evidence for the Battle of Agincourt, which people find very surprising and almost quite amusing in some ways, but considering how important it is in English history. So, but Agincourt isn't alone either. There are other famous battles such as the Battle of Crecy. We still don't know exactly where that is. Even more importantly, one might assume, the Battle of Hastings. There is still no archaeological evidence to tell us exactly where the Battle of Hastings is, apart from Battle Abbey, which is built on the site of where Harold was supposed to be killed. And so we're assuming that that is accurate. And this list is extensive. There are hundreds and hundreds of battlefields and we don't know where they are. But what might also surprise you are some of the battle sites which have been identified. And this is really bizarre. For example, in the Talenser Valley in Germany, there's a Bronze Age battlefield which has been discovered in northeast Germany along the banks of the Talenser River. This has got, for example, a minimum number of individuals of 100, including 40 skulls. So it's not just a small assemblage of information, there's a huge amount of information. And this is a Bronze Age battlefield from 3,000 years ago, for example. So what do they have? Well, as you can see here, they've got, this is a humerus. So it's that bit there, and somebody's shot in with a flint arrowhead. And then on the bottom right, we've got a Bronze Age bronze arrowhead that's penetrated the skull. But not only that, because it's a waterlogged site, there is evidence, and there are a lot of examples of wooden artifacts, such as mallets and mauls and hammers. And these don't generally ever exist on an archaeological site, because they just disappear and rot away. So this is why sites like this are incredibly important, because it tells us what people were doing, the not so pleasant side of what they were doing in the Bronze Age. And to be honest, it's not that different from today. So, uncomfortably so. So that's a Bronze Age battlefield. So we can't find Agincourt, but we find one from the Bronze Age 3,000 years ago, which is a bit weird. There's another battlefield called the Varus battlefield, when the Roman legions fought the German tribes in a location between the Kalkriese Berg, which is the Kalkriese mountain, and the Gross Moor, like the box. So the German tribes lured the Romans through that narrow gap and then set an ambush for them. And all the Romans were completely annihilated by a bunch of German tribes. Rome didn't like this, obviously, but it became very famous. And so this is from 9 AD, so 2,000 years old, and we can find extensive evidence of that battlefield. So that's where the assemblage, you can see all the little red dots, that's the assemblage of where all the artefacts are coming from. As you can see, it is where it's supposed to be, in that narrow defile between the mountain and the moor. So that shows that the stories were true. Basically, the Germans lured the Roman army to a choke point and then attacked them very successfully. So that shows that the road network, or the transport network at the time, was very important. And those artefacts comprise things like coins. There's a very famous face mask from a Roman military helmet. But most of the artefacts are very small, the equivalent of buttons and buckles and military equipment that's fallen off, or rather been hacked off Roman soldiers as they were attacked. And this is what we find on many battlefields. So imagine all the people in this room. Imagine if you took every single artefact off your clothes, so your glasses, your bunch of keys, and your belt buckles, whatever else you had on you, and then deposited them in the corner and ran away. That would be the assemblage of what would be available in this room if somebody, the equivalent of a Roman army, was attacked with swords and edged weapons. Rather gruesome, but it shows what's available at the time and what's left behind. So, back to Ellendune. Do we know where Ellendune was fought? Does anybody actually think they know exactly? Because I can't find any literature that pinpoints it exactly. So we know it was fought at Ellendune, and now, as we're here today, it's potentially identified as near Wroughton. But where? And this is where Battlefield Archaeology could potentially either prove it or disprove it. If you use Battlefield Archaeology procedures on another site and then you found direct evidence that it's somewhere else, then of course it can't be in two places at once. So you can use it to prove or disprove a hypothesis. So the question arises, is it possible to prospect for this site, as in Ellendune, and collect evidence to support any potential site? And the answer is obviously yes. So by using the discipline of battlefield archaeology, you can look for and potentially find artifactual evidence of an event. In a way, it's a bit like a shipwreck. When the ship goes down, it encapsulates everything that was on that ship on that day. Not a few days before or a few days later. So a battlefield is a bit like that. It's an event that happened over a very short period of time. So battlefield archaeology, what is it? Well, I've defined it as the investigation and recording of archaeological evidence related to open area mass combat, which sounds self-explanatory, really. So battlefield archaeology, we just said, deals with the historic and prehistoric, remember we're dealing with prehistoric battles, as Talenza shows us as well, conflicts in what were once open spaces. So that is conflicts that were not fought around an earthwork or a structure, or such as a castle, or a fort, or a town, or a city, and which do not exhibit structural remains as part of that conflict. Well, I think at the moment, Ellendune probably falls into that category. So open battles rarely had a focal point, and are regarded as being more fluid. So a battle moves around in the landscape. Rarely does it sit in one place as people retreat and withdraw or attack somebody else. So they're more fluid. Consequently, battlefields are very difficult to locate and to define, and certainly almost impossible to put a limit or a border around. You can't say this bit is the battlefield and that bit isn't, because unless you, even if you found artefacts, you don't know where the artefacts stop. So the archaeology of a field of battle is often simply that, the archaeology of an open space, although obviously some sites are now no longer totally empty either, as they've been built on or developed. And this is a site at Masterby on Gotland, and my friend Maria Lindstrom has been working over this site for years and years. Yeah. So the focus. Is it possible to find a focus on any particular battlefield? But if there is a structure in the field connected with the conflict in question, such as a memorial or some sort of earthwork or an associated grave, for example, if you know this grave belongs to somebody who died at the battle, they're not going to take them to the far end of the country, in theory. If you find two graves or a mass grave, then of course the evidence starts building up in favour of your hypothesis. And then these features can be targeted using standard archaeological procedures and methods. So in that perspective, you've got somewhere to start. It's easier to start the project and persuade other people that you're onto something rather than going into a middle of the field and going, I think the battlefield is here. So that's one of the problems we have. But where on the battlefield does a monument lie? Does it lie in the centre of the battlefield? Does it lie on the edge of the battlefield, or does it lie completely somewhere different? And this is the Masterby Cross on the Masterby battlefield. As you can see, there's a massive concentration of artefacts surrounded by the circle, and there's just a few that tail off towards the Gren's Cross, which is there, shown you there. Now that Gren's Cross is known to be part of the battlefield, but as you can see, when the artefact assembled, it's nowhere near it. So of course that's the other thing we have, is how close it is or far away from the actual site. And many historic battlefields projects have been initiated because of finding something on the site that was already there. So following the targeting of a specific feature, including probably the first real battlefield archaeology project at the site of the 1876 Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana, in the USA. Now obviously most of us are at a certain age where we remember General Custer and all the stories connected with Custer attacking the Indians and all this sort of stuff. Typical cowboys and Indians stuff. Well, a lot of it started from this story about Custer. And this project started on that battlefield, and what they did is they systematically walked over the battlefield with metal detectors looking for artifacts such as this, the bullets, and then they plotted where they were and say, hello, here is an assemblage of artifacts. So in that respect, and as what we found out, the primary context or interest on most historic battlefields is almost two-dimensional, and that is, generally speaking, the evidence generally lies within 20 to 30 centimetres of the topsoil over a given area. This might be imagined more like a large-scale map than a deeply buried archaeological site. So if we rolled through everything off our clothing and everything and then ran away, all the artifacts wouldn't be here then, they'd all be on the floor. And then you'd have gone. So this is what we're looking for. We're looking for an assemblage that is a very, very thin layer of the ground. So this requires specific types of archaeological prospection, recording and protection as well. How do you record and protect it so it's not destroyed? So targeting the residue of the former battle so that it can help build a picture of the battle is now seen as the best way of recording this. And here's a map of the Town battlefield, and some of our work, Simon Richardson and I have been doing for years now, in fact 30 years next year, that's how long we've been doing it. And as you can see, there is an artefacts assemblage over this piece of ground, and it's very concentrated in certain parts and other places not at all. So the most productive way of targeting the residue of former historical battles within the topsoil is by metal detector surveys. Now remember, we're talking about an era where metal is obviously being used. So if you talk about prehistoric battlefield, where they're using flint implements, a metal detector isn't going to work. So such surveys are now used extensively, for example, to discover the sites of the medieval battlefield of Wroughton, like we've been doing here, of which our work there was the first to undertake. It was the first systematic battlefield survey carried out in Britain 30 years ago. And here's one of the assemblage of things that we've found. These are medieval arrowheads, and it's still the largest assemblage of medieval arrowheads on any battlefield, as far as I know, in Europe. We stopped looking when we had over 350, because one of the problems of this is they're made of iron and they fall to pieces within years. But the question arises, so I'm going to start. Utilising volunteer metal detectorists at towns such as we did with Cyrus, we located and recorded extensive areas of medieval conflict, such as arrowheads and the graves of the former combatants. And this is one of Simon's artefact assemblages that have been taken to the Royal Armouries and photographed and x-rayed and recorded. And now it's a very good assemblage, and most of these are now gone. They've just crumbled into dust. You can't protect them unless you seal them in something. Ooh. But the question is, as I put in the bottom there, would you be able to recognise these as medieval arrowheads if you came across them in a field? And the answer is most of them no, because they don't look like arrowheads. Most of them just look like rusted bits of metal. So that's one of the other problems, is can we, even when we have the evidence, can we recognise it for what it is? There's also the matter of topography. Which pieces of the landscape are more likely to have been fought upon at the time? Now at Wroughton, it's quite a narrow band, as you can see, and that's due to the terrain. On one side we've got a river that flows down the Battersea, on the other side, just like the Calcrease battlefield, it was all very boggy and marshy at the time. So it was a very restricted area they could actually fight in. So knowing about the landscape and how it looked and how people treated it in the medieval period, you find out more about where they could actually fight. Going back to Masterby for Maria's site, the types of topography and watercourses present are important in order to understand the landscape of battle. And this sort of Masterby battlefield, as I showed you the artefact spread before, they've superimposed the area where the bog used to be and is now being drained, and it's just flat fields. So they had to find an old map where the bog used to be, and they worked out that the concentration of the battle and all the battle-related artefacts were where people used to cross the bog. So it was a very small, defined, well-defined area, and that's of course why it was fought over. So again, just like the Calcrease site, know something about the site, the topography, the geology, etc., and the waterways, and you find more about your site. Oh yes, and this, as I said before, Maria's work at Masterby on Gotland in Sweden was inspired by our works. I know Maria really well, and I went out to help her on some of her initial surveys. And because we work together, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So if somebody says, is there anybody on this planet who does anything stupid like try to record a medieval battlefield? And I go, yeah, me. They go, excellent, right, I don't have to do all that again. So we all help each other out by finding like-minded people who are crazy enough to go and look for a medieval battlefield. Here's another project you might have heard about. This is the battlefield of Bosworth. And Glenn Ford's work, metal detecting these areas. So all those grey places are where the fields where they metal detected, and all those dots relate to all sorts of different artefacts, including the now famous cannonballs, lead cannonballs from the battle. And this is 1485, remember. So those are very early cannonballs. But oops, wrong way. But not just that, other important artefacts like the boar badge, which was the boar badge of King Richard III. This one's a silver gilt one, so it was obviously with somebody high up, one of his retainers obviously lost this on the battlefield on that day. So again, by knowing something about the landscape, this is actually based upon the Roman road. Why? Because that's how they got to and from the battlefield. So by knowing something about the area, where they were going from and where they're going to, you can meet somewhere in the middle and find out, well, somewhere the battlefield should be along here. So it's a good place to start. Something I found a few years ago is that, unbeknown to me, in Poland, another group had been looking at our work and started their own battlefield project on the Battle of Ellendune from 1410. And they've done the same thing. They've been systematically covering the landscape in metal detector surveys, and we're finding this assemblage of contemporary horseshoes, but also all those, they put little icons where they found things, so little arrowheads and crossbow bolts, and you can see where the main assemblage is. Well, that's the battlefield. So, archaeological evidence of a 9th century battle, what would we be looking for? Fortunately, we have a nice display left here by Paul, so you can have a look afterwards. But what would we be looking for on a 9th century battlefield? Well, I've nicked this picture from the Franz casket because it's quite nice, because it shows things like medieval shields, swords and spears, and even archery equipment. So you see what they would have been fighting with and what they potentially left behind when they lost and ran away or they were victorious. Now, as I said before, this is quite nice, a nice illustration, because of course this battlefield shows you that they are fighting next to a church. But that's not what we consider the Battle of Ellendune at the moment. It might change completely, but was it fought near a structure or an earthwork or a fort or whatever? So we can't start with this hypothesis. So what we need to do is look at another battlefield, which of course is the most famous one, is the battlefield at 1066 and the Battle of Hastings. And this is quite a famous scene because not only does it show all the people wearing all the mail and the helmets and the spears, but it even shows you at the bottom of the picture they're collecting. It's somebody taking a mailed vest off this person. The swords, this man's collecting all the swords off the battlefield, somebody else is stripping a dead body, there's a helmet there. And so they conveniently tell us what was on the battlefield they thought was valuable. Well, the problem here is, if they thought it was valuable, they would take it with them. So one of the problems of medieval battlefields is that most of the things that are there that we're looking for have already been removed by the people who fought there. So the big things, the helmets, the swords, and with Paul will show you in a bit, the mail vests and this, that and the other, have already been removed. So unless they get hidden for some reason, like they fall in a hole or a bog or down a well, then of course you can't, you're never going to find them. So what we're looking for generally, here's a nice helmet from Anglo-Saxon Helmet, and a photograph of a grave with an assemblage of weapons associated with it. So you could argue that we know what they were supposedly fighting with because we find them in their graves. So we do find lots of Anglo-Saxon graves if we don't find a battlefield. So we look at various weapons from other contexts, such as archaeological finds from graves of the period, we can get some form of idea of what we're looking for to be discovered. And this is something Paul will show you later on. But we're talking about spears, helmets, parts of shields, and various types of weapons, and this, that, and the other. And occasionally, like at York, somebody digs a big hole, and this was something like a cesspit, and somebody threw a helmet and a spear down, and remained there for 1,000 years or whatever, until an archaeologist comes along, digs a big hole, enters the cesspit, and there at the bottom is the now famous Copygate helmet with a spear associated with it. So we do know what these people were wearing in their conflicts from other assemblages. There's another weird assemblage from the 7th century. It's a Staffordshire hoard, And this has just been published by a friend of mine, Chris Fern. And when they analysed all the pieces of the gold and garnet equipment from the Staffordshire Hoard, I'm sure you've heard about it, it was worth about £3.5 million or something. It was extensively researched. They worked out that virtually everything are parts of weapons. Swords, fragments of swords. There was a big ceremonial processional cross made of gold, which some priests would have been walking through the middle of the battlefield with, essentially getting killed or whatever. And other sorts of things. There were very few artefacts, such as brooches, that weren't definitively battlefield related. So we even know from hoards that we find, there are other famous hoards which just have weapons in, for example. Back to Maria's work on Gotland at the Masterby, and she just published her PhD, so you can read all about Maria's work now. And what she did from years ago, and here's one of her superimposed every piece of land that they metal detected on. So she started in 2006, and every year they went back and they surveyed another little bit of a field or several fields or whatever, over and over and over again, until they come up with this massive assemblage of artefacts that you've seen the spread of. So the landscape is divided into small areas, and each area then systematically metal detected in a gridded pattern. Mind-numbingly boring work. Believe me, I went and did some work on there, and it's not exciting. But the results are. This is how we generally do it. So what happens is you take a little handheld GPS device, you get your metal detector, you metal detect something on a gridded pattern, so you walk up and down a field, you record it, where it is, for example there, then you walk on a field, then you find another one, so you record that. And what happens is you get a very large area where you've covered in metal detector surveys. You can prove it, because you can prove you've been there. You put that on a map and you start to produce evidence of where certain types of artefacts are or whatever. So one of the problems related to artefacts is that whereas mass graves from a battle lead to a great deal of media publicity, individual and basic artefacts gathered by metal detectors are often not so. So you get the headline grabbing things, oh, I've just found a hoard of gold, I've just found a mass grave or whatever, but your mind-numbing work of systematically walking over a battlefield does not produce the same sort of public interest. So much potential material is being lost due to uncontrolled metal detecting, whereas apparently insignificant artifactual material goes unrecognised before being discarded. And this is the sort of thing that we found at Masterby. So again, these are all crossbow bolts, crossbow heads, arrowheads, and they don't look very inspiring. And these have to have been cleaned up and preserved. There's also things like the spurs, spur rolls, and then more arrowheads. A huge amount of work. And this is the residue that's left over when you pick out the things that you're interested in. Because most of the things you're finding is that. And at Masterby they collected and they saved all their junk. And there are crates and crates full of scrap iron. And it's mind-blowing to see the amount of rubbish. So every one of those artifacts had to be metal detected, then dug up and going, oh, it's a nail. And they saved it and then did some more surveying. Thousands and tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of metal artifacts, most of which are absolute rubbish. So, recognition. What is junk and what is valuable? How am I doing for time? All right. What is valuable? For example, what's that? Fragment of spur. Well done, sir. Yeah. Sometimes you think, oh well, I don't know what spur from the right period looks like. But remember, that's not covered in mud and the rust residue and everything else. So yes, that's a fragment of spur. So what's that one? Bit of axe. Any ideas? No, that's also a fragment of spur. But on the period of the Masterday, they had two different types of spur. They had the prick spur, just the point, and they had the rowel spur with the wheel on the back. And of course that is covered in more rust, so it's not as easy to, still not covered in a lot of mud. So you might come up with a handful of mud with a metal artefact in it, and you still don't know what it is. So this goes to show the amount of work that goes into all these battlefield sites. Right, what's this one? Bit of tractor, bit of rubbish. This one's quite rare, because that's the crossguard of the sword. So sometimes you have to catch yourself, oh, it looks like a piece of tractor. Oh no, actually it's a piece of 14th century sword. So it's quite important. And what about that one? Well, we've seen loads of those. Looks like a lump of rust, but these are actually a crossbow bolt. And this is, I'm very proud of this one because I found this one. What's that? That is a fragment of mail. So half of a ring, not even half a ring, of mail. I was chuffed a bit when I found it, but I was looking for an arrowhead. Anyway, so even the smallest of things, remember that's not covered in mud. You've got to clean it all off and see what it is. And initially I thought it's just another nail. I thought that's perfectly round. And it turned out to be a piece of fragment of mail. Now this one's a good one. What's that one? Remember it's on the 1361 battlefield. So what's that? Is that rubbish? Do you put that in the rubbish pile or do you keep that in the... I'm very interested in this pile. That is a Viking brooch. Very interesting. Completely nothing to do with the battlefield or the battle. So of course you've also got to take into account that you are actually going to find other archaeology of all the different periods while you're looking for your medieval battlefield. So you've got to keep your wits with you, because you don't know literally what's going to turn up. But if we consider that such artefacts are rare, then the graves of the people who fought are exceedingly so, but not unheard of. And here's the mass grave for the Battle of Ellendune around in 1996, and the drawing that we did of all the superimposed skeletons once we'd cleaned them all up and recovered them. So battlefield archaeology as a discipline should also focus on the remote archaeological evidence of the event under investigation, as well as on the field of the ground on which it was apparently fought. This evidence might not necessarily remain on site, such as weapons, which always can get dragged off to somewhere else, or provisions or whatever. So you might be studying the battle in question, but you might have to look elsewhere. And there's a really good example of this. This is particularly so with some of the people who fought in or became caught up in the conflict. Could anybody think of a good example of that? Some of their remains might not be found on the battle site at all and have been removed. And their remains remain archaeologically evidence of the battle, but might not be imminently identified as evidence of the battlefield archaeology. For example, there's this chap. I'm sure some of you recognise him. He's now very, very famous worldwide. There he is in his grave, and of course it's Richard III. He was killed on the battlefield of Bosworth on a certain day, almost to a certain time, and then they go and find him in 2012. So evidence related to battlefield archaeology, the people who died in the conflict, single graves and mass graves. So here is the battlefield at Visby. So we're talking about artefacts generally. Well, at Visby they found several graves. There's 5 altogether. They've excavated 3 of them. And these people actually had their armour still on them. So there's metal coifs over the head, plate armour on the bodies, and there were several hundreds of 1,200 bodies found in those graves. So the evidence might actually still be on the people that fought. And then there's this famous mass grave from Dorset, the Dorset Ridgeway, and these are the Vikings who were killed on a specific day. We don't know yet what the day was, but these individuals obviously not only died, but they were all decapitated and heads stuck in another part of the road. So whoever won that particular conflict wanted to make a specific case of it. And then there's quite a boring example from the 7th century battlefield, the Battle of Chester. And these are just Christian burials, so we can see from the Viking graves, obviously they're just heaped in a pit, no specific orientation to them. But the Christian ones, the Battle of Chester at Herronbridge, were all laid out in a Christian manner, so head to the east, feet to the west, etc. And lots of them all systematically laid out. And at Towton, we've now found evidence of not only the mass grave from 1996, but also various other graves of individuals all with weapon trauma on them, so we know they fought at the battle. And then we also did some work on the battlefield itself, looking for the mass graves and the general mass graves that were known to exist somewhere. And then one day I was doing this geophysical survey of this Corners field, and we found 2 human teeth on the surface. So, being an archaeologist, we dug a hole in it, find out what was underneath the teeth, and that was a pit full of bones. Hundreds and hundreds of bones, and that was 1 square metre, and over 300 bones came out of it. So we knew we'd found the edge of one of the mass graves from the Battle of Towton. Obviously without huge amounts of expense and everything else to go with recovering human remains. So that's how we left it. So we know where they are, we know roughly what they contain, and these are the small bones, the finger bones, the toe bones. There was small sections of spine, all tiny bones. And the rest, the skulls, all the long bones, had been removed in 1484 when Richard III gave a grant to clear the battlefields. So these are the bones that were left out after these mass graves have been officially emptied. But on the battlefield at Aljubarrota in Portugal from 1385, we've got exactly the opposite. They've got ossuaries of all the bones, the big ones, that have been removed off the battlefield and put next to a chapel and church. So these were the skulls and the long bones and the very big bones. So all the things that we were missing, it existed because somebody had taken these long bones and skulls and put them into consecrated ground. So we had what was left over in the gravesite, where they hadn't been very successful, and they at Aljubarrota, they had the other end of the residue, all the bigger bones. So this is the sort of thing you can look for potentially on a battlefield. And of course, on so many battlefields, we now recognise that memorial chapels or churches were built to commemorate the battle, or more likely, the commemorate the dead who fought in the battle. There's very famous sites like Shrewsbury from 1403, the Battle of Hastings 1066, and also the lesser known battles like the Battle of Ellendune in 1016. So what we're doing now is we're looking for the grave, just like Aljubarrota, we're looking for Richard's Chapel, which is somewhere near Towton Hall, and there's supposed to be Richard III's memorial chapel. Nobody can find it, but inside that chapel there's an ossuary of all the bones that were removed from the battlefield in 1483. So somebody one day is going to have a nice surprise and we're going to find remains of a chapel and hopefully thousands of bones from the battle. So battlefield archaeology includes putting all of the available information together and all the evidence and information together. So we require an understanding of, as I've said, the topography, the road network, the weapons and the equipment used, how the commemorative chapels were potentially set up to pray for the souls of the dead. And so, as a summary, I'm near the time, as more battlefield archaeology projects are undertaken, so many other battlefield heritage groups are inspired to initiate archaeological surveys of their own. Hint, hint. Only in this way can more of these sites of conflict be recognised and recorded for what they are. Thank you very much.
We have got time for 1 or 2 questions to Tim. Just be aware we do have a fairly lengthy interval, so if you don't get to answer your question, you ask your question, you could do so at the interval. But does anybody have any questions for Tim?
Yeah. You mentioned Hastings. You mentioned the Battle of Hastings, yes. But there's no evidence as to where it took place. So why did they decide on the village hamlet of Battle? When they said, what made them...
It's the historical text. So that history tells us that certain things happened in certain places. Now, as archaeologists, we tend not to believe them. It's as simple as that, because if there's no proof of it, then obviously anybody can say anything. Some people have taken this to ridiculous extreme lengths and say, well, the Battle of Hastings happened miles away or whatever. But until somebody finds the physical evidence, that's the problem. People will say what they want and there's no evidence to contradict them. So in that respect, it's historical text, and we're going to hear from the historians and the historical texts about various battles, etc. But that's the problem. Without the archaeological evidence, it's open to question.
It's just that